All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Coöperism 413. And welcome to our guests, Betania Asi and Antonio Pele from Rio and Barcelona. And welcome to all of you, and thanks for coming out this evening. In this fourth seminar of Coöperism 1313, we turn to forms of political organizing, resistance, and cooperation in Brazil, including Brazil's Landless Workers Movement, the Mothers Movement, the Roofless Urban Movement, and other forms of cooperation in Brazil. I was originally struck and stuck in a way by the Landless Workers Movement because it's one of the largest social movements in Latin America today, although the roofless urban movement may also be very comparable, and we'll be talking about that. But it's a remarkable movement of about 460,000 families who have come together, working together in forms of cooperation, forms of collectivity, to take over land that isn't being, that is not productive, and to turn these unused lands, which they occupy and settle, into productive agrarian farmland. These aren't simply rogue occupations. They can be sanctioned by the Brazilian government. These movements have lawyers, and through their legal counsel, they try and get title to the land. And thousands of these settlements have become legal under law that requires that farmland be productive. I think Antonio will tell us a little bit more about the political economy and actually how much available land there is, despite the private property laws. But 60% of these movements' occupations have been ratified at this point. And they become not just farms, not just producer cooperatives, but actually societies that include education, schools. So there are now 2,000 movement schools across Brazil, and they teach all kinds of beautiful topics in their curriculum, including not just farming and land rights and inequality, but also protest and cooperation. So I was struck by the forms of cooperation involved there, and also in the ways in which they change and have changed over time. From, in this particular context, a model in the 1990s, which seemed more traditionally cooperative, producer cooperatives in a kind of old-fashioned, more traditional approach that we're used to, maybe in the North or in the West, to at present a very different form of cooperation based on the values and cultural context of the people from the countryside. How do you say properly, compañes? Is that compones, yeah? And that word is the farm worker, the person who works the farm. The rural worker, sometimes we referred to them and still do as the peasants. But there's a certain kind of culture focus on family, on land, that is different in different cultural contexts, and that has brought about different forms of cooperation, which makes this such a unique space to explore these questions. Now, to help explore all of these questions, we welcome two brilliant critical thinkers, Betania Asi of PUC University Rio, and Antonio Pele, also of PUC Rio. And they're going to discuss not only the Brazilian Landless Workers Movement, but other movements as well in Brazil. And so it's my pleasure to welcome Betania back to New York City. Betania has spent a lot of time in New York because she got her PhD here at the New School in philosophy. And she's now the professor of law professor at Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro and at the State University of Rio de Janeiro. Betania has made landmark contributions in philosophy and critical philosophy, particularly as evidenced in the 2 essays that you shared with us that we posted on the website that are brilliant. And just, I know it's going to create a remarkable conversation here. Betania Assi is the author of an important work on Hannah Arendt, which is called Ethics, Responsibility, and Judgment in Hannah Arendt, as well as an important book called Theory of Law and the Subject of Social Injustice with Jose Ricardo Conha, and is currently working on the next book, which is on the subject of injustice, political action, law, and empowerment. And that's co-authored with Rafael Rollo and Alan Hilane. And you developed there a rich theory about both injustice and justice, based on the concrete experiences of injustice that you study empirically in the words of persons who are in these spaces of precarity. It's a fascinating theory of justice. We're going to talk about it, but it threads this really remarkable needle between the Kantian paradigm of universality and the opposite paradigm, some kind of particularity or identity that you associate with Aristotle and Hegel. But I think it's a really rich theory that tries to find something in the middle based in part on the concrete experiences of the subjects of social injustice. And it also develops a fascinating counterpoint to a number of theories of precarity, of biopolitics, Agamben on bare life, Akilimembe on necropolitics, Butler on precarity. I think you're developing something that is that turns really that work in a more positive direction. So I'm really excited to talk about all of your work. And we also have with us Antonio Pelle, or should I say Sol Flaneur, who joins us from both Brazil and Barcelona. In Brazil, Antonio is professor of law at the school at PUC Rio University, where he writes on critical theory and human rights. He just finished a Marie Curie fellowship, which is one of the most prestigious fellowships around in the European Union. He was in Paris at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales on a project called Making Humans, Human Dignity in the 19th Century France, And there he explores how notions of human dignity, namely the value of the human being, was shaped around issues related to social justice, women's rights, and anti-racism struggles. He's been writing prolifically in this area, particularly of human dignity, but at the intersection of critical theory and human rights. He's been a previous collaborator in the 1313s. We had an extraordinary session down in Rio that he hosted on Paulo Freire's The Pedagogy of the Oppressed back in 2019. And that was really a treat to be doing Paulo Freire in Brazil. In addition to being a brilliant critical thinker, he is also an extraordinary musician who goes under the name of Sol Flaneur, and I hope that you will join us this evening for the launch of his album. So we're going to go across the street after this session, and we're going to launch the album that he's been working on for about 4 years now. So that's going to be extraordinary. So we're going to start this evening with Antonio on the Landless Workers Movement, questions of co-power, and then branch out to the many different forms of resistance and political organization that Betania will discuss in her essay, The Mothers Movement, the Cooperative Resistance in the Favelas during the COVID-19, the Roofless Urban Movement, or MUST in Brazil. Welcome to Coöperism 413. Welcome, Betania and Antonio. Antonio, do you want to take off?
All right, thank you. Thank you, Bernard, and thank you, Kiana, for the invitation and the organization, of course. So I'm going to talk about the Brazil Landless Worker Movement as co-power or as radical co-power. So my talk will be divided in four parts: a brief introduction, first; second, the context and history; third, the struggles; and finally, the MST, the movement Copower. So, introduction: Brazil Apart. Brazil Apart is also a title of a book on Brazil by Perry Anderson. Wonderful book. So, introduction: Brazil Apart. Brazil is the fifth largest country in the world and the biggest country in Latin America. It is also one of the world's most unequal countries regarding income distribution. For example, the wealthiest 10% of the population holds 46% of the country income. Brazil also holds one of the highest land concentration. For instance, in the countryside, less than 1% of the landowners control 46% of Brazil's farmland. Peasants are hardly able to possess their own land and are sometimes, very often, I would say, they are sometimes very often forced to work under slavery-like conditions in so-called fazendas and latifundios, the name of very large properties. And Brazil has been repeatedly condemned by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Those people are the sem terra, without lands. This situation, these dramatic situations, come from the Brazilian history, with in particular, we call that the Seis Marias, which were large land grants that were given to privileged Portuguese families, along with the long-lasting institution of slavery, only abolished in 1888, like one of the latest countries in the world. Over centuries, Brazil's agrarian priorities were shaped through massive monoculture and export-oriented production. In this context, actual and progressive land reform face major difficulties. It was actually a potential agrarian reform initiated by the president João Goulart, and this land reform was very tiny, only applicable to some public land near highway. It was this potential land reform that triggered the military coup in 1964, of course, with other issues. During the brutal 21 years of dictatorship from 1964 to 1985, the longest in Latin America and one of the cruelest, brutal in Latin America, a so-called conservative modernization caused rapid industrialization, the continuous destruction of Brazil's ecosystem, rural migration, urbanization, and industrialized agriculture. This type of agriculture was conceived as a solution to foster food security and later as a solution to hunger and bringing development in Brazil and elsewhere. Since 1988, with the return, despite the return of democracy, and with in particular Lula and Dilma Worker Party governments, agribusiness has kept destroying the Amazon rainforest and has turned Brazil into the world's top consumer of pesticide per capita, the world top consumer. It is important to recognize that from a strict rational point of view, if we were on Mars, on the moon, looking at Brazil, there should be no agrarian issue in the country. Indeed, only 10%, 9.4% of the land is cultivated in the country. There are also 600,000 kilometers of degraded pasture in Brazil. It's bigger than France. That could be potentially restored. Brazil also holds, it's not the US, it's not Russia, it's not Europe. Brazil holds the largest reserve of arable soil in the world. To put it succinctly, there is space for everyone in Brazil with industrialized intensive agriculture and family community-based agriculture. However, the agrarian issue is omnipresent in the country. This paradox naturally traces to broader phenomena, as Eduardo Galeano mentioned at the end of his famous Open Veins of Latin America. I quote Galeano, referring to Latin America. In these lands, we are not experiencing the primitive infancy of capitalism, but its vicious senility. Underdevelopment isn't a stage of development, but its consequence. Latin America underdevelopment arises from external development and continues to feed it. That was the introduction. Second part, context and history. The struggle for land and equal rights in Brazil is historical and structural. Historical with, for instance, under the Portuguese colonization, the political resistance of Zumbi dos Palmares and the creation of quilombos, the settlement of Afro-Brazilian people. It is also structural with the favelas, where millions of families intend to work and try to have decent living condition despite state neglect and violence. In the case of the Movimento do Sem Terra, MST, the Landless Workers Movement, it is important to recall that the birth of the movement is linked to the previous organizing of the first peasant movements in the 50s and the Comissão Pastoral da Terra, the Pastoral Land Commission, organized by the Brazilian Bishop Conference in the mid-70s. For instance, and through different publications, the Catalan Bishop Pedro Casal de Laga warned the public opinion of the destruction of the rainforest and exploitation of multinationals. During the dictatorship, a robust section of the Catholic Church, especially through Paulo Freire and the Theology of Liberation, has been engaged in the pro-democratic agenda and influenced the MST. This is reflected in the fact that the MST, so the Movimento Sem Terra, all right, is a non-violent movement. Its members do not carry weapons. It prays friendship and community and relies on a spiritual political practice, the so-called mystica. The MST emerged in 1984, before also, but I mean the official date is 1984, as a social movement, first in the south of Brazil, then as a nationwide movement. With roughly 1.5 million members, it is often described as the largest social movement in Latin America. And some authors compare this movement as the movement of civil rights in the US. Following the data available from the MST, it has an estimated 160 rural cooperatives, 190 associations with 5 or 4 credit unions, and 140 food processing plants, over 70,000 agricultural settlements, and a national university and a network of almost 2,000 primary and secondary schools, and more than 450,000 families affiliated, and it has enabled the redistribution of 80 million of hectares of lands. In 1993, the MST took part in the creation of La Via Campesina, an organization that described itself as the voice of the peasants and an international movement that bring together almost 200 million peasants, small and medium-sized farmers, landless people, women farmers, indigenous people, migrants, and agricultural workers from all around the world. The type of action of the MST is based on political and historical education and formation. This idea of formation is crucial. And the latter has enabled the MST to respond to external forces and give it internal strength. With the awareness that one is still and will always be a Sem Terra, even if they are now able to farm a portion of land in a settlement. The idea is to keep this Sem Terra identity and to help those who do not have anything. MST settlements and larger policies embody a Gramscian counter-hegemonic approach to Brazil oligarchic society and status quo. They aim at creating, following Foucault, I would say, a counter-society with new values and ideas that will challenge eventually the hegemony of Brazilian elites. Third part, the struggles. So in Brazilian, Reforma Agraria na Lei ou na Marra. Translation, agrarian reform by law or by any necessary means. It was the slogan of the first Congress of Rural Workers in Brazil in 1961. The objective of the MST is to organize poor citizens to pressure public authorities into allocating land to agrarian reform settlements for landless families. It used constitutional law, the media, negotiation, and co-governance with federal authorities. The 1988 constitutions embraced agrarian reform and defined property rights by their social function. The MST insists on the primacy of the constitutional clause, notably the Article 186, which stipulates that in order to be accorded legal protection, property must also fulfill its social function. It is under this constitutional clause and other law that the MST occupy lands and seek legal titles. According to the 1985 agrarian law, it is possible to declare of social interest and to expropriate farmland which is not farmed productively. This law is enforced only through direct action. The MST also occupies state and federal public fallow lands, which it anticipates it would be evicted. They will be not evicted. Many judges in Brazil keep on applying the civil code approach to property rights. This strict legal orthodoxy can criminalize MST members. However, in a very important victory for MST activists, Brazil's Supreme Court ruled in 1996 that land occupation that aim at hastening reforms are substantially distinct from criminal acts against property. Occupation are strategically planned involving 300 and 3,000 families that will, through non-violence, build an assentamento or a settlement. With each occupation, an investigation is usually undertaken by the Institute of Colonization and Agrarian Reform to define whether the property can be potentially expropriated. If the owner does not agree with the amount of the compensation, he can go to court to challenge the expropriation. The occupation per se is illegal, but the MST occupiers can accurately claim that the aim is to secure enforcement of the law, which provide for expropriation of the property. And we can reframe this idea of playing with the law to the Foucauldian idea of illegalism. I will move to the final parts. MST cooperation. So when we read the webpage of the MST presentation, we can read the following: a cooperação é princípio elementar exercitado cotidianamente. My translation: cooperation is a basic principle that is daily put into practice. Among its different features, coöperism imply, I'm quoting Bernard, taking the most promising forms of cooperation, those that are most true to be values and principles, and agglomerate them to create an integrated political, economic, and social whole that can displace the existing framework. During 40 years, the MST has succeeded in building a framework for promoting mutual fair, health, environment, and other tasks. I would like to just define the different level of cooperation. Excuse me. In the settlements, through small and medium-scale collective associations that usually rely on the family and components way of living and working, the MST has developed flexible settlement forms of cooperation. The Settlement Association is the governing body of the settlement. This association functions as a participatory cooperation democracy and is responsible for making the collective decision. It decides over the internal policies and structure, the project of the settlements, and the management of the common property. It is a settlement association that owns legal title of the property. Larger settlements are organized through nucleus units of roughly 10 families. The settlement association can decide to adopt one of the three modes of property rights or a combination of them. The settlement can function as, first, a full cooperative. Two, it can be parcel and families are assigned and farm their own lots. They do not possess the latter. Or it can be unparcel, with families being assigned to farm specific sections of the settlements. Another level of cooperation and co-power is related to the housing mode of living. The so-called agrovilla organize the collective structure of habitation. In the settlements, homes are grouped together and are not spread far away from one another. The agrovilla intends to foster, I quote, cooperative communities of families. Collective infrastructure are built around the agrovilla, like schools and healthcare centers. A third level of cooperation and co-power stems from cooperative informal and formal work. Mutirão is often used in Brazil to describe voluntary and collective work during a short period of time. It is especially used in the MST settlements to refer to the collective informal voluntary work of the member. Another level of co-power can be appreciated in the MST service cooperatives. The MST has successfully implemented service cooperative related to some specific dimensions of the production, namely credits, seeds, machines, loan, marketing, education. The MST agro-industry is wide and diverse. It includes the production and distribution of milk, honey, fruit, vegetables, coffee, and are produced under the MST brands such as Sabor do Campo, Terra Viva, and Paladar. To give you some numbers, just two numbers. In 2022 and 2023, the MST has produced more than 16,000 tons of organic rice and 37 million liters of milk per month. In the title of this piece, of this presentation, I suggest that MST co-power is radical. Indeed, its radicality comes from many reasons. First, this radicality comes from the magnitude of the different combinations of form of cooperation, production and distribution of products, for instance, and the magnitude of different ways to leverage cooperation. For instance, the MST operates its finance and has successfully raised in 2021 42 million of reals, like $8 million, to fund agriculture's cooperatives. Second, MST radical co-power is a symmetric response to the degree of violence, precarity, and injustice that millions of Brazilians are suffering. With a colleague, Natalia Baldezar, we have described it as a necro counter-revolution that target the most vulnerable population in the country. The necropolitics of Achille Mbembe, and the counter-revolution defined by Bernard Arnault. We think that in order to understand the injustice in Brazil, we have an assemblage of necropolitics and counter-revolution. So the MST is a radical response to the magnitude of this necro counter-revolution. Third, MST radical co-power succeed in displacing this prevailing necro counter-revolution by struggling for agrarian reform, providing novel policies and strategy to reduce and mitigate long-lasting social injustice. It is not just a rural movement, it is something else. The MST embodies a movement that turns the ideals of radical and cooperative democracy possible and actual in Brazil. For Daniel Carter, I quote, "The MST is a specter that haunts Brazil's secular inequities it represents a struggle to achieve equal rights and full citizenship for everyone. Fourth, MST Radical Co-Power revealed the need to reevaluate our critical standards when we examine people who face severe hardship of precarious existence. I'm referring here to a passage of D.F. Hassan in his wonderful book, Life, a Critical User. We should be very careful not to be, especially from critical theorists, we should be very careful not to mistakenly interpret their existence in the way they are treated by authority, like bare life in the Angambien vein. To the contrary, especially in the case of the MST member and occupier, they refuse to have their existence reduced to its most basic expression. As many other movements and organizations across Latin America, they preserve and build their own communal dignity, resisting structural violence and state neglect. Finally, MST Radical Co-Power is engaged in fighting the climate crisis and the preservation of the environment through the promotion of agroecology in settlements and cooperatives. Since the 90s, the MST has initiated a green turn advocating of agroecological methods in the settlements. Even if some issues still persist around this strategy, it reveals clearly that the welfare of the environment is at the core of the MST Radical Co-Power. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. I'm particularly interested in exploring this confrontation of co-power versus necro counter-revolution, which is a fascinating way of setting this up. And I was particularly taken by where you ended, which is this idea of the members of the landless workers movement refusing to have their existence reduced to its most basic expression, which I think feeds perfectly, Betania, into your entire philosophical approach. So, to you.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Good evening, everyone. I want to thank you, Bernard and Kiana, for being here today. It's a pleasure. Also, Antonio. Okay. I want to start saying that this is part of a work in progress book, as Bernard has already said, and is also part of a project called Spheres of Citizenship, a partnership between PUC-Rio and Humboldt University, and which Antonio is also part of this research. And I want to start to thank you, the mothers that we have been working with for the last 2 years. I used to say that without them, there would be no possibility to build any kind of theory of injustice. And I say that they transform me in the way I see philosophy every day that I am with them. So they are not here, but I know that at some point they will hear this, and so I really want to thank them. I want to start with a very brief note, which is why to propose another analysis of dealing with justice. So I'm kind of in the law school, so everybody knows that justice is one of our main topics in law. So why not starting from justice instead of injustice? So just want to say very, very briefly that the point is that on the one hand, if we take the neo-Kantian normative grammar on theories of justice on the one side, and if we take the theories of identity that I basically rely on Aristotle and Hegel's philosophy, we would have on the one hand a kind of abstraction. In abstraction somehow reflects a lack of problematization of the theoretical impact of the concrete experiences of justice. So on the one hand, there is an identitarian quest for justice, which is mainly the result of identity politics. So abstraction from one hand and political identity from the other hand. I think that both define justice either as abstraction or as a community belonging, and in terms of either universal reason or identity. But I guess that in both cases, the archetypical morphology of the rule of law remains mainly reproducing the same representational scheme in which concrete experiences of social injustice are simply not accounted for. So that's my starting point. So if we take the concrete experiences of social injustice as our departing point, my proposition is, I propose that we take the concrete experiences of the subjects of social injustice as our primary lenses. This entails asking, and that's my main question in this presentation today, how does the production of knowledge of the subjects of social injustice radicalize a certain philosophical ground implicated in dealing with justice? And by radicalize it, I mean, how does their production of knowledge mobilize, push, intercept, challenge a political philosophical grammar in dealing with the theorization of justice? And just a brief remark, I'm not saying, I'm not exhausting the topic. I know that we have much to explore, but I want to attempt to formulate a set of concepts, notably the production of theoretical knowledge that comes from the protagonism of those that fighting against precarizations and vulnerabilities. So that's my priority. But to get into that, I want to, before getting into what I'm calling this kind of attempt to get with a theory of injustice, I think it's very important to take 4 preliminary steps very briefly. First one, framing the subject of injustice, and oops, sorry. In what I mean by framing the subject of injustice, I'm not considering merely a subjective feeling of injustice. I'm rather referring to the vulnerabilities produced by class, gender, race, disability that provide the main substance of the dispossessed, socially, economically, and politically invisibilized subjects from the suburbs, the slums of the large peripheries, individuals marginalized from social movements, victims of state violence, homeless, illegal immigrants, subject institutionalized in mental institutions, juridical asylums, or in prison system, to name those few notorious examples of so many unrepresented national and supranational subjectivities. So that's my frame. I'm talking about subjects of injustice. That's what I have in mind. That's the first remark. My second remark is what I call the temporality of, my second remark is regarding the statement that, okay, thank you. It's very difficult to manage both. Thank you. Thank you very much. So the second remark is, I'm claiming that social injustice is violently produced and reproduced. By that, I mean, I think we have, this process has been called by many names: biopolitics by Foucault, Berlife by Agamben, necropolitics by Mbembe, precariousness by Butler. So, and then it reaches the subject in many ways, state and international levels, affecting subjectives individually, mentally and physically, collectively, structurally, institutionally. So my main point here is that, okay, I'm assuming that this subject is has been reproduced by state violence. But my question is, what about beyond political capture? Concrete experiences of injustice, they can engage also from the point of view of those who suffer injustice, knowledge, empowerment, and resistance. Okay, they have been subjected to better life, to violence, but my claims here is that besides that, I'm not compromising, but besides that, they produce knowledge, they produce empowerment, and they produce resistance. And this is attached with a process of political subjectivity in which it is entangled political existence, political resistance, and political co-resistance. So we will see later how those three dimensions are completely engaged. In order to exist, they need to resist. In order to resist, they need to resist collectively. So these three, we cannot separate from social movements those three levels, which changes a lot the way we see our grammar in terms of individual and collective rights. I will get to this point later. So my third remark is very briefly what I call it the temporal dimension of experiencing justice. We know from law field that the time of justice is the time of the process of justice, is the time of procedure of justice. One claim here, taking the Yaminian philosophy, is that injustice has a very specific temporal dimension, and that temporal dimension is the time of urgency. An analysis of concrete experiences of social injustice needs to take need of time, and this kind of temporality of urgency is the temporality of urgent necessities. Who suffers here and now, and urges for reparation, what Benjamin called the Jetztzeit. My fourth remark. Besides temporality, the concrete experiences of social injustice have a particular spatiality, the topos or factuality itself in which vulnerability takes place. I distinguish here at least three layers of factuality. First, we have to take into account historical, geopolitical, and cultural structural background of the experiences of social injustice, such as the legacy of slavery, heritage, coloniality, structural racism, patriarchy, epistemic violence, cannibal capitalism, ecocide, and so on. The second layer, the actual vulnerabilities such as who, where, how, under which conditions and backgrounds the experiences of social injustice take place. This, in turn, leads us to our third layer, the corporeality in itself. The intersectionality of the factual body of the subject of social injustice, such as race, gender, social class, disability, territoriality, and so on. Those three layers allow us to perceive the concrete physical and mental suffering of just injury. Here, some of the main references are Brazilian theories of coloniality, Lélia Gonzalez, Paulo Freire, and critical legal race, Fanon, Carneiro, and Flausen. So now I come to my epistemic, the fourth is the epistemic protagonist. About whom we are talking about. Who are those faces? Who are those subjects of injustice? I'm claiming all the time that I'm taking the concrete experiences of justice, but I didn't show anyone, no? Which kind of concreteness am I talking about? So here are, I mean, we have been working with 2 years now with 7 movements, social movements in Brazil. It covers a variety of political and cultural experience of merging of injustice, resistance, and knowledge produced by some of the social movements in Rio de Janeiro, 4 movements of mothers from favelas and peripheries of Rio de Janeiro, who had their sons and daughters killed by state violence, mothers of Manguinho, mothers of Baixada, mothers of Maré, Jacarezinho. We have another movement called Museu da Maré, Maré Museum, a museum projected and constructed by residents of Maré Favela under the coordinator of Cláudia Rose and Luiz Antônio Oliveira. We have worked with Conexão G, a collective of transgender activists from Maré Favela, coordinated by Gilmara Cunha. And we work with an occupation called Benjamin Filho, a culture and education urban squatting settlement only for women and children. We now I come to I work with some of them in the example that I'm trying to bring for you today. But then let me come back to my first question in order to work with the social movements. What I'm trying to do is a theoretical attempt to frame a picture of how those protagonists of social injustice impact a philosophical grammar dealing with justice. And that's the picture that it's good that's not only me. So I'm not going to be able to really explain the whole picture that I'm trying to develop, but just very, very briefly to introduce a preliminary and multi-layered theoretical framework. According to this preliminary research, the subject of injustice will become a protagonist in struggling against the very injustice which has been befallen them, develop strategies and actions that indicate different dimensions of social existence and different levels and contexts of social organization. By dimension, we have, at first, we could expect it to adequately represent a comprehensive facet of some impacts of knowledge production by those subjects that have an ethical, an epistemological, and a political dimension. So I'm claiming that they, by their knowledge and resistance and power, they impact a theory of injustice ethically, epistemologically, and politically. On the other hand, I'm not going to really get into those. We can come back to that later. On the other hand, in terms of level, these different and differential dimensions take place on different levels of social organization. By social organization, I mean broadly the context of strategy and obstacles faced on the levels of individual existence and subjectivation, collective coexistence and struggles. I'm paying more attention in this presentation because we are talking about cooperation, and an institutional structure. So they also impact in individual level. Of course, they can get really ill and empowered at the same point, and they construct subjectivity, they construct a political existence, but that political existence imply coexisting, fighting together with another subjectivity. So we are talking about a subjectivity that's not constructed within itself. It is based in collectivity. So I will come back to this later. So my key point here in those levels is that there is a deep implication between existence, coexistence, and coexistence. Yes. No, you can go on to, I go to the mothers. Yes. So what I'm going to try to do is bring this theoretical picture, some examples how I would see their expression in the social movements. And I will concentrate mainly in the mothers movement. And I put the two mottos of mothers movements: do luto a luta, from mourning to fight. And another one that's quite difficult to translate, nós por nós. I put two attempts in translation. It is us by us, or the we for the us. In the next I want just now introduce the four mothers that I have been working with. Mothers of Manguinhos, it's led by Ana Paula Oliveira, who had this 19-year-old Jonathan son killed in May 2014 with a gunshot in the back. Mothers of Baixada Fluminense with Nívia do Carmo Raposo, who had their son Rodrigo killed by state police in October 2015. Rodrigo Nívia's son was murdered at the door of his house after refusal to carry out robbery in the region. Nívia Raposo is a member of several networks, Ana Paula as well. Mothers of Maré with Bruna Silvia, who had her 14-year-old son, Marcos Vinicius, executed by the police in his way on walking to the school in June 2018. And mothers of Jacarezinho with Sandra Gomes, who had their son, Mateus, killed by police in May 6, 2021, in the so-called Chacina of Jacarezinho. Chacina of Jacarezinho was a massacre who took place in 2021, May, in the favela of Jacarezinho during a civil police operation that resulted in at least 29 people being shot or killed with cutting objects. It was the deadliest police operation in the city of Rio de Janeiro. Just for you guys to have a kind of a territorial orientation, what I'm talking about, this is Rio de Janeiro. Copacabana is very small up there into the sea. You have the Atlantic Ocean and Copacabana down there. And then you could see that I'm talking about Manguinhos is a little bit up, Jacarezinho upper, Maré, and then this huge place called Baixada, which is considered the most violent place in the city of Rio de Janeiro. When you go to Rio de Janeiro, you see Copacabana, and it's so beautiful and so nice, but it's very good to know, to have the picture from which territories am I talking about. So we have these four networking of mothers. Baixada Fluminense, I want to show you guys the picture of them manifesting. That was just after the Chacina da Baixada, the massacre of Baixada. You can go. We have mothers of Manguinho. You will see how, and we are going to talk about that theoretically, how they use the performance, the picture, the way they dress with the shirts and they manifest. We have mothers of Maré, and we have very recently Favela do Jacarezinho, Stop Killing Us. So if I come back now to my theoretical framework, I mark on the yellow marks are precisely what I would say that my theoretical attempt to frame a picture of how the protagonism of social injustice impact this grammar, I'm going to take the grammar that comes to the mothers movement. I'm trying to show some dimensions and levels that have been articulated through the mothers movement. So I will not have time to explore each one of the yellow frames that I came up with, but I'm going to focus on what I'm calling political coexistence cooperations. You can go on, please. The first theoretical frame that's important to highlight is the relationship between illness and a coexistence. That these two structures, they come together. They get ill, very ill. I'm talking about mothers who have lost their sons by state police. So the feeling of illness, it's huge. But when you look a little bit closer, illness is always coming together with powerfulness, companionship, collaboration. The relationship of the individual with violence is intertwined with the social and collective dimensions of suffering. The same suffering that in the same reasoning is embedded in a complex network of violence and recognition of violence and resistance. These subjects, which personal pain and collective political action build a common ground of experiences. With that, they shared an agency against the state, producing a constant mobilization of political structures. Mobilization is concretely carried out by them, victim subjects, in their struggles, routines, and specific localized claims. The other aspect that I want to highlight is what I call it political subjective of her existence. And I'm quoting Ana Paula. My son left me and transformed my life for the second time. This mark means a re-inscription of the self in the world. This new production of meaning for life is oriented towards the search for justice and against violence, permanently directed at bodies considered less than human. Another aspect really important on that grammar is co-resistance, a phrase from Nívia Raposo. The love of our children for our loved ones is much stronger than any trap set by a racist, classist, and manipulative society. Gradually, we are mobilizing and getting strength. Each individual victory is celebrated as a collective one, always making a resistance using a non-violence pedagogy, Paulo Freire, and always delivering in the strength of the collective. We do a job with effort and dedication like ants, embracing and providing necessary help to these families, because we understand, and that's why I call coexistence. We understand that their pain are our pains. Next one. Another part of this grammar is what I'm calling political mothering. I don't know if you pronounce like that. Mothering, political mothering, which comes with cooperation and resistance, transformative justice, and what I call performative rights. If you see this scene, Bruna is what she's doing right now. She, as a kind of instrument of political struggle, Bruna uses the school shirt with the blood of his son Marx that Marcus Vinicius was using the day he was murdered. What does it mean? Does it mean that there is a kind of performative justice by using the shirt with the blood of his son? And they have a long discussion about this political mothering that they themselves are building. Another example is what I call performative justice, political subjectivity, and coexistence. This is an act in front of the Baixada Fluminense homicide police station. And I call it, I'm calling Ana Paula. Fatima ends up becoming one of the witnesses of Jonathan's case. We met from this. She took me by the hand and told me, let's fight. We cannot remain silent. Let's join forces and go to the fight. At this moment, the Mothers of Manguinhos movement were created. Our joint crying grows louder, searching for justice and aiming to save the lives of other children. Our fight, above all, is for the lives of all people, but especially for those who are in the main target of this violence. It's very interesting to see, I'm not going further, how the courtroom is transformed in the next one, Bernard, as a kind of performative space. They use the courtroom, and that's very important for us. We're dealing with the performative of a judgment. They use the court hearing as a place of politics, and they use it like visually. I could go over and over. Describing the way they decrypted law, in the sense that they know that they are against law when law produces violence, but they know that they have to use the machine of law to produce justice. So they have a very plastic way of dealing with law. We should go further because yes. One of the last points, the production of political statization of memory. That's one of the points I highlight, because this idea that you use art to construct a contra-narrative and a contra-grammar. It's very important for them. And I'm quoting Nivea. I realize that graffiti is functional because it is visually beautiful, makes a memory claim, and transmits a symbolic value of the family. Therefore, we have been doing a work that I consider to be an affective justice. Because I know that our justice is fluid. I know that there is an opposing force that insists on maintaining our status quo like victims. And I want to finish with 3 quotes that I think is one of the most emblematic ones. The first one is Juan Ana Paula. Every time they go to an act, they use a T-shirt with the picture of their sons. And Ana Paula says, many times I ask myself, my God, what will happen if in the end of all of this, the policeman who killed my son does not answer for the crime he committed, and continue to think that it is normal to take another person's life. And then I began to understand that throughout these 7 years, I, Jonathan's mother, have done justice to him. Another phrase that is very powerful is when one of the interviews I asked Nivea, how could you take it? I mean, I'm a mother, there are many mothers here. How could you take? And then he answered me this phrase that I think really impacted. He said, I have no right to do nothing. And for me, this is an absolutely ethical dimension that leads to the responsibility of the mothers with the mothers, but also leads to the responsibility of us, what I call the subjects of justice. And that's really powerful. And the last one, Ana Paula, who says, I have learned that every day I wear the shirt with my son's picture on it, I'm doing justice. I'm doing justice. Every time I use the picture of my son and I go to a struggle, and I go to an act, I go to a protest, I'm doing. She doesn't say I'm thinking, I'm reflecting. She's saying I'm doing justice. That's what I call performative mothering justice. Thank you very much. I need to think it's the time because I already passed 2 minutes. I would like to.
Want to tell us about it a little
Just
bit?
very quickly, this is a funk. It's a 2 minutes funk made with the mothers and the musician, and it's very interesting to say the relation between empowerment, because it's about the aquilombamento, it's about the quilombos and how the quilombos is a kind of collective join together. So the mothers movement also involved this kind of coming back to ancestrality, coming back to the kind of rescuing the cultural heritage that comes with violence. So you guys will see the mothers, and the whole idea of the funk, it is us by us. No? That's the whole point. And I have translations.
Menino de 12 anos morreu hoje durante uma operação da Polícia Civil. 2 policiais militares foram flagrados forjando a cena de um assassinato. Uma arma foi colocada nas mãos de um jovem morto para parecer que houve um combate.
Favela vem dizer, a rua vem dizer, é nós por nós. Hoje o quilombo vem dizer, favela vem dizer, a rua vem dizer, é nós por nós. Papo reto nosso, vou te passar a visão, já que a real não se vê na televisão. Essa mídia tem um lado, ser porta-voz do Estado, como muitos nos ferrando, se passando de aliado. É chegada a hora os divergentes se juntar. Partimos pro caô, não há quem possa segurar. O problema não é meu nem seu, é nosso, não sabia. Fomos cortando a mostrão, não somos minoria. Hoje o quilombo vem dizer, favela vem dizer, a rua vem dizer, é nós por nós. Hoje o quilombo vem dizer, favela vem dizer, a rua vem dizer, é nós por nós. Papo reto nosso, vou te passar a visão, já que a real não se vê na televisão. Essa mídia tem um lado, ser porta-voz do Estado, como muitos nos ferrando, se passando de aliado. É chegada a hora os divergentes se juntar. Partimos pro caô, não há quem possa segurar. O problema não é meu nem seu, é nosso, não sabia. Fomos cortando a mostrão, não somos minoria. Hoje o quilombo vem dizer, favela vem dizer, a rua vem dizer, é nós por nós. Hoje o quilombo vem dizer, favela vem dizer, a rua vem dizer, é nós por nós.
All right, thank you very much, Betania. Thank you. You've been doing amazing work, and thank you for sharing it with us. Okay, so here's what I propose. I think I'm going to try and tease the relations between the different movements and the work we've been presented with, and then open it up for conversation so that we can all jump in and kind of both comment, theorize, ask questions, but get a conversation going about the forms of cooperation that are taking place in these different movements in Brazil. And the place I think to start is with the overarching structure, your theoretical structure, Betania, which is captured in this notion of co-re-existence, right? And the three pieces there. So let me start there. I want to make four. So I'm going to talk about four things. But the first is the way in which co-re-existence offers a bit of a theoretical framework to relate kind of the individuality of existence with forms of cooperation through movement, mobilizing, and resistance. I mean, those are the three pieces. And of course, it comes from your original framework of contrasting kind of universalisms or ideas of thinking in universal terms and thinking of in very identity or individual or particular terms, right? And that in a way is the relationship between the existence, which itself can be considered kind of individual, and the co in there, which is the collective, and trying to figure out how we can create forms of cooperation from a space of individual existence that serves through resistance to create a collaborative, a collective that allows for coexistence. And all right, so there's the theoretical framework, which asks questions about the relationship between the individual and the collectivity, I think, and that's very important. And it works and it operates through the middle term, which is resistance. Okay, now that resistance, I take it, this takes me then to the second point, works through, I think this is where one can introduce the notion of co-power that you were that you were developing, particularly in the context of the Landless Workers Movement, Antonio, trying to figure out what is co-power here. Co-power being, I take it, the political dimension of this co-re-existence. There's a political dimension. I'm going to get to the legal dimension in a second. That's the third comment I want to make. But the second one is something about thinking about political power. And this is where I think it's either the co or the re in co-re-existence. Maybe it's both. Co-re is where power enters into the picture in terms of a form of resistance to all of the ways in which subjects, vulnerable subjects here, whether it's the mothers and their children, or the landless workers, right? Vulnerable subjects are resisting their vulnerability, but also resisting the way in which they are only described as vulnerable. And so this is, I think, your intervention, Tanya, which is so important, which is to say, no, we can't just think about this as bare life, right? I mean, yes, of course, it is bare life. It is the production of bare life. But in a way, focusing too much on bare life doesn't give sufficient room for the political resistance and the production of a positive, constitutive side of resistance that leads to empowerment, knowledge, and political subjectivity, in your words. That is the same. I think that brings your two interventions together through this notion of political power. We're calling it here, or we can call it here, co-power, something about the power that comes from working together being the flip side, right? The positive side of the negative descriptions that are so familiar to us. Biopolitics, Foucauldian biopolitics as a description of the way in which we regulate life, right? Or necropolitics, Memembe's term, or pure precarity, right? The flip side of that is something about this second dimension, which is the political dimension, which is the dimension of kind of power and working together to create a positive constitutive side. So it's both co and re in your terms. Now, the third dimension is the legal. I thought it was very interesting the way law is so important here. Of course, it's so important in the landless workers movement context, because that's all about, as you were suggesting in your post, Antonio, turning forms of illegalisms into legalities, right? It's actually using the Brazilian Constitution, Article 186, on property rights to convert these occupations into legal title. So much of this operates through law. Were it not for that article, all of these occupations would be simply repressed as illegal, right? It's working in that gray space, taking advantage of that, and taking advantage of a remarkable article in the Brazilian Constitution, which is deeply lacking in the American Constitution, right? Which is that property must fulfill its social function, right? Think about that. That's a remarkable principle, if it is applied, obviously. But I mean, it's something, at least it's an ideal that in this country we would have extraordinary potential, right? To think that property actually has to fulfill its social function, right? So we see law playing such an important role in the landless workers movement as a way to put into place the second dimension, which is the positive constitutive co-power, to put it into place. We see it in the mothers movement as well, right? With courtroom, you were talking about courtroom as a performative place. Of course, that's exactly what we were talking about last seminar when we were talking with Jocelyn Simonson and Tracy McCarter about the Stand with Tracy movement and the way in which they were using the courtroom as a performative place to challenge the district attorney and the power of the state to criminalize what were acts of survival, right? Okay, so the third dimension, so the third dimension then is this legal dimension, which seems so central. And it's through this legal dimension that these movements can create spaces of cooperation among the people who are struggling that can serve, that can then serve this positive constitutive side. And then I think then the last dimension has something to do with then the ways in which these forms of working together actually manifest. What are the cooperative ways that, how does cooperation manifest itself? And as I was listening to you, I was thinking of different ways. In your case, Bethania, I thought a very powerful term you used was political mothering, right? I thought that's a beautiful term that is worth reflecting on. Political mothering. Another term that you had was a lot of jointness, right? Which of course is a form of collaboration, cooperation, but joining forces, joint crying, those seem to be important ways in which cooperation then manifests. In the landless workers movement, I was particularly interested in the way in which cooperation manifests differently, that it manifested differently over time. And in part, Antonio, I read this in your article as well as in the article by Aldiva Sales Diniz and Bruce Gilbert on cooperation in Brazil's landless rural workers movement, which was on the readings for today and is on the website for anyone who wants to read that article. It's a fascinating article because what it does is it tries to figure out exactly how does ultimately this fourth dimension, cooperation, play out. What does it look like? In the same way in which, Foucault is so fascinated in relations of power and in micro power and in kind of like all of the micro forms that power plays out in. Here, we can focus on all of the forms in which cooperation manifests and operates. And so this is where I think it was particularly interesting to read. This is on page 23 of the article by Diniz and Gilbert, how the forms of cooperation change over time, starting from a place of more ordinary cooperatives, the kind of worker cooperatives and the kind of assignments or ways in which producer cooperatives work in America and elsewhere, in Land O'Lakes, and all of these traditional forms of producer cooperatives. Those producer cooperatives, they were attempted early on in the landless workers movement, but they didn't work. They didn't gel. There was resistance to them. And at least according to Diniz and Gilbert, and in reading your article as well, and it seems as if the resistance was related to the fact that there was resistance to division of labor, right? It was an overly kind of rationalized producer cooperative approach that did not reflect the values of the people who were engaging in the struggle. Interestingly, there was an undervaluation apparently of children's labor in these producer cooperatives, in the traditional producer cooperatives, an undervaluation of the way in which children could participate in these movements. There was a sense of too much specialization, right? There was a sense that there wasn't enough attention to the urgency of the movement, the urgency of the moment, and too much of a rationalized projection of the way in which producer cooperatives should function. And ultimately, that led to the failure of a lot of the traditional division of labor producer cooperatives, and then a turn to different ways of engaging in cooperation, which seem to be more prevalent today in the landless workers movement. And so a reorientation towards families and the nuclear familial unit. And it doesn't have to be, and families don't have to be here considered from a heteropatriarchal perspective, but the way in which people come together to take care of children, multi-generational families, etc. Families seem to play a really important part in this movement, and it was only in bringing that element back in as a way in which cooperation is structured, right, through assemblies of families, that the cooperation really started to work. Logics of rural land worker sociability is what they describe in their article around page 29. They write that the collective associations are explicitly linked to their roots in the family. And so instead of thinking about the ordinary producer cooperatives, what they've been able to do in the context of the movement there is to reorganize and reconceptualize the nodes through which cooperation operates. Okay, so so those are four dimensions that I think are important, really important to this conversation, and that I wanted to put particular emphasis on because they really link your two presentations, the different movements that you talked about. Also, you didn't have time to talk about the movements of in the face of COVID, so mutual aid projects in the face of COVID-19, and also the ruthless urban movements in Brazil as well, which are, I take it, more urban equivalents of the Landless Workers Movement. So I think we could explore each of those examples. I mean, right now we have on the table two very concrete examples of ways in which cooperation works in these different movements, but then there's also these other ones that we have in the work itself. Maybe that's a good way to kind of open up the discussion, unless there's something you want to add. Antonio, I see
just quickly, because in Brazil and elsewhere, it's hard to grasp the magnitude again of the violence that those mothers are suffering. Just to give you two numbers now, the homicide in Europe is between a year 3,000 to 5,000 people. We don't talk about the war, all right, if you want peace. In the US, homicide in the US is depends, but okay, in Brazil, 50,000 per year, right? Along with the homicide, police, gangs, or paramilitary, each year in Brazil, 80,000 people disappear. Half of them are children. We don't know what's going on because there is no public institution who are looking for those people. So each year, that's why former philosopher, thinker Diaz do Nascimento talk about the genocide of Black people or indigenous people. So 50,000 people are killed, plus 80,000 people that disappear each year. So it's a certain level of violence, and of course you have to add a social economic violence. I don't know, half of the working population in Brazil earn less than $1,000 a month. So it's this structure, and Brazil is on the top 7 richest country in terms of GDP. So the income distribution in Brazil is the last thing I would just want you to give a comparison. Top 10 in GDP, the income distribution in Brazil is a little above as the devastated country Sierra Leone in Africa. So it is a kind of country we're talking about. That's why it's very important the kind of courage of those mothers or the MST.
Gives a sense of the sense in which it is such a large social movement too, the mothers movement, right? I mean, right. We're dealing with proportions. I mean, we're dealing with extraordinary proportions here that lead to such large social movements. Okay. All right. So maybe we should open it up then to thoughts and comments, etc. Preston, do you want to kick us off?
All right. Hello. Thank you for coming and speaking with us today. I really enjoyed your presentation and, sharing your thoughts. So I had a question, and to get some context, because I've been thinking about this. Earlier this week, I was in a class and I had this critique of the Supreme Court. I'm not too much of a fan. I was calling a lot of what they were doing as byproduct of corruption. And a professor told me to my face, in front of the entire class that I should be careful about what I say, because there was recently a couple of Columbia students who lost their jobs because of their comments, and that I needed to understand that I should be careful about which institutions that I critique. And that made me think, especially with the context of what you all were talking about today, about how we could build this world or a movement in the face of, either institutions or the police or some type of force that is actively working against creating the world in which you're trying to create. So, I'm definitely not trying to draw an equivalency between, I guess what you all have done, the police and your movement and here, but I would like, if you could, to explain how to go about that, like what maybe mentally you have to prepare for in the face of power, and then also what practical steps you can make on the ground, actions, when you're fighting against power, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, Preston. We're going to take a few more. We're going to take a round of 3, but let me just emphasize how much sense that makes. I mean, you have to. I mean, yes. I mean, we have to be cognizant of the forms of resistance to resistance, right? I mean, and that's what we see here. I mean, not only do we see, I mean, and that's the piece of kind of like the violent resistance to the occupations, well documented in the Hammond reading, for those of you, Hammond reading, which is also online. But I mean, the forms of violence that are meted on folks who are trying to occupy and trying to take title to land that's not being, right. So it's in a way, it's not just the forms of violence that are producing these extraordinary rates of disappearances and police killings in the favelas, et cetera, that are leading to the movement itself, but it's resistance to the movement itself, right? Yeah. So yes, so we definitely need to address not just the forms of repression that produce the need for the movement, but the repression of the movements themselves. Thanks, Preston. Max, and then Stefano, and hold on. Okay, all right. Let me bring you a mic, and
So I just wanted to amplify the comments about legality that Professor Harcourt made, and that, Antonio, I think you brought up a little bit with your discussion of the Constitution of Brazil. And in particular, I wanted to bring up 2 things. One is the relationship that came to my mind about the common law doctrine of adverse possession and Article 186. And for those who don't know, adverse possession is a property law doctrine that allows for land that's not being used to have its title handed over to those who are using it. There are a lot of challenges with this that don't make it as flexible as what we're seeing with MST in Article 186, but something that I wanted to put on the table. And then the other thing is I was sort of thinking about the social function of land. And, immediately for me as sort of an optimist, I felt that phrase conjured up some beautiful realities, but it's also not hard for me to imagine a phrase like that in the United States being used to say that, okay, the deserts of Arizona need to be turned into golf courses. And I guess I'm curious about, Antonio, from your perspective, how you think that phrase has been used to embolden or support MSC as opposed to used to crush the movement.
Let me get you in the next round, Stefano. Let me pass the mic to Kelsey Jost Cregan. Can you get the mic? Kelsey is actually the supervising staff attorney here at the Human Rights Clinic at Columbia Law School, and is a lecturer and professor here, and directs the Extractive Industries and Social Movement Project at the Human Rights Project right here. So go ahead, Kelsey.
Thank you so much, and thank you both so much. We work with campesino movements in the Bajo Aguan in Honduras. So, we work on our project with campesino movements in the Bajo Aguan in Honduras. So that resonates very closely with us. And I wanted to say I found the Brazil example and something that you said so interesting for this reason, because you mentioned there's enough land, which is very different in some ways than parts of Honduras, and yet the violence is still so persistent. And so that had me sort of thinking about why, you said in theory, these two models can coexist, like there's enough land for them to both exist. And I was thinking in relation to what Bernard just said, we've been working on categorizing the violence against these movements, looking through a counterinsurgency logic and how law enforcement is viewing movements as insurgent, and using things to break down the cooperation of the movement. So they infiltrate the movement, they target and stigmatize the movement. And that was making me think how much cooperation is seen as a threat, and what that tells us about whether, why these different sorts of forms of living are seen to not be able to live together. And I was thinking about agro-industry in particular, and how much it relies on non-cooperation. So it relies on ability to use labor, cheap labor, and not have laborers participate in profit. It relies on non-cooperation in the agriculture itself, with monoculture and pesticide and the elimination of sort of more agroecology. So more, I'm in that dreaded area of perhaps more of a comment than a question, but perhaps also a question of just, I think it's—
But you should feel free to, because I mean, you're doing so much work in the area. So we're really interested in what you're seeing.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that just really struck me, this question of why, if there is in theory enough land, the violence persists. And I do think agro-industry sees cooperative movements as a real threat to their ability to continue to function in the way that they have been functioning. And so I thank you all very much for the presentations, which were so rich and really left me thinking.
Thank you, Kelsey. Okay, before we go to the next round, which is going to start with Stefano and then Allison, and then Ryan. Antonio, do you want to address, and then Betania, some of these issues and questions?
So the last remark, why? I quote so the book is from the beginning of the 70s, no? As Venas Abiertas de América Latina. So he's basically saying we don't want Brazil to develop, no? So they pressure to control this country from outside, especially from maybe the US. So there is still this kind of Marxist point of view that can be a way of understanding this reality. After, well, I think there's a future. I mean, I think that there are long-term strategies. There are the reserves, so we have to think about the future. So I think we keep those spaces that are not used have some values, and will have more values in the future. So it really depends to whom they will belong. So it's the rational point of view, but again, there are power relations, and the oligarchy in Brazil is thinking in the future. So I think the time is very important to take into account here. The question of Preston, how to fight power, that's what I like with this idea of co-power, because I was very careful with the idea of cooperation or mutual aid, because I find them a bit inoffensive, you know. But when Bernard in the book talk about co-power, I like that because they are offensive. When we describe the MST, we sometimes call the legal offensive legality, not a defensive legality, but an offensive legality. They're not going to just protect their land, they're going to contest some decisions. So there is a kind of action, direct action that is offensive, and they're dangerous for the status quo. So I like the idea of co-power because it will be offensive. It doesn't mean that you have to use, and I think it will be a mistake. We have discussed that in those seminars. You don't have to use the same weapons as your enemy. It can be a trap here. You don't have to use the law, but not the same strategies. No? So this idea of co-power is offensive, and it displays this idea of the circulation of power. So how the MST is reframed in Brazil by the mass media, after we can talk about how the modern movements is reframed the mass media is very interesting, but how the people usually do not support the MST in Brazil. It's not why? Because they're breaking the law. They are Marxist. They're against. As they're breaking the law, you know, they're playing with this game. They're breaking the rule of law. You're breaking the rule of law. So it's the ghost of the dictatorship. So they're playing those games. The civil servants, politicians, intellectuals. So that's how the MST is reframed in the mainstream public opinion in Brazil. Your question about the social function, social utility, I didn't get the last part, but I do remember there's something that rings me a bell. This idea of social function, social utility is also at the core of the French Revolution. It will be something at the core of the book of Thomas Piketty. It's still over there. It's still here. But your question was comparing social function with something else. I forgot exactly what it was.
Yes, I'm just trying to get at that. The term social function is sort of ambiguous. And so if we're thinking about the social function of land in the Constitution, and that being the constitutional basis on which MST's appropriations are.
It has to be, the land has to be productive. How do you know the land is productive? There are some official public report about the production of the land. Unfortunately, even under Dilma and Lula government, those reports were artificially high. Why? It's a point that I just mentioned. Who has the land in Brazil makes the law. I mean, the majority of the deputies in Brazil, or large majority in Brazil, are the landowners. So they control also the government for different reasons. So how do you know the social utility is the production of the land? How do you make this production? How do you evaluate these productions? Through national report, but those reports are usually artificially high. You know, so after we have all the strategy of the MST, but I give the word to Lasagna.
Just to add, Antonio, you haven't mentioned, I think it was Kelsey who haven't mentioned the stigmatization. And it's very important to realize that in Brazil, the MST is considered a completely illegal movement by the press, that constantly being attacked by the press. I mean, I'm not talking about one press, I'm telling the press. And what is absolutely amazing, and I don't have mentioned that, is that they constantly created a space of counter arguments. They try to build a counter discourse all the time. So they do this kind of work that we are not used to consider as day by day, daily. I mean, when we consider failures, we say, okay, we I failed. The sense of failure in that, it's absolutely constitutional to the struggle. So they fail all the time. They fail more than they get recognition for it. That's why we have been discussing that, Antonio, has mentioned. That's I had a friend who asked, but they are very close, very close movements. It's very difficult to get in. And then Antonio gave a very good answer. Of course, they have to be very close in order to protect as much as they can the production of what they have been doing, because the Brazilian society as a whole, they consider MST an illegal movement, and that goes to also kind of to your question, because to consider the social function of the property, it's a threatening, it's a permanent threat. It's a vocabulary that's quite good in terms of writing rights, but it's very complicated because it's very threatening to think, okay, it's a labor that's doesn't help the movement sometimes, and you are absolutely right. So how to manage those things, and that I think that's just to go to your comment on legalism, because MST in most of the social movements in Brazil, they made us think in a completely different way between legality and illegality. Because for a law student mind, we have the illegality once you have the law, and then you turn into something legal. So the whole process of turning into legality, it's quite like an institutionalization of a movement, of a struggle. In the MST, they have been considered illegal for the whole time. So there is not this moving from illegality to illegality. So what they do, they develop a completely sophisticated grammar of this hybrid relation between legality and illegality. One example, go to a case in which they know they're going to fail. Okay, but to be in court is a political movement, even if I didn't get anything in terms of a sufficient answer, but to use law and as an instrument, as a key for fighting justice, that's absolutely amazing. We don't learn that in law, in law schools, that law is a key, is a political key, even if you don't achieve exactly what you are fighting for. So, and they bring that perspective to us broadly. That's absolutely amazing. So they make us think law outside the law.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fascinating. And actually that ties directly to a session we had last year, Utopia 1313, with Cornell West and Derica Purnell and Amna Akbar. And we were rereading a piece by Cornell West that he had written in 1990 called The Role of Law in Progressive Politics. And in that piece, he really argued that the role of law is a kind of defensive mechanism. It only serves a defensive mechanism. And that in a way, Cornell was trying to defend the lawyers in the movement, to give them a role, because they were in a way they were under attack, because because everybody wants to be an organizer, a movement person, and not a lawyer. And so the question was, well, how do we fit the lawyers in? And in the article, it's a defensive thing. It's always a defensive thing. It's like to maintain, to kind of like defend against prosecutions for protesters, to try and kind of keep some ground, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But here, right, and actually during that whole session, which was a marvelous conversation, the struggle was to always find why always defensive? what's the offensive? And here it is, right? I mean, here is the perfect example of law not simply trying to create protective rights or something, but law actually being used as the vehicle for social transformation, for property relations transformation, right? It's actually, it's the legal arm of, it's the legal arm which actually turns out maybe to be such an important arm of the movement. You know, you think of, you know, movements, they're often, you know, there's often the, you know, military arm of the movement, there's whatnot, but here it's almost as if it's the legal arm that is the one that is most offensive in trying to gain the title, right? And not just a right, but title, right? I mean, the political economic transformation is going to take place through the combination of the occupation and legal intervention. Right? And of course, I mean, for those of us who aren't used to this movement or something, and of course it's viewed so disparagingly. I mean, it's the same way in which squatters are viewed, right? In Western society, right? Squatters are viewed as, you know, just this, you know, illegal occupation, right? So, yeah. All right, Stefano. Yeah, it'll come on if you push it up. Push it up.
Hello.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Hi. Thank you for your presentations. It was very interesting. I have two questions, one for Antonio and one for Bethania. For Antonio, one is, or I guess you could also both answer this. So MST is both a Marxist organization and a social movement focused on a single issue. I actually, in one of the essays, it said that they had popular support, but that was also like, the data was from the 90s, so I don't know if it's changed or something like that. But my question is, how important or perhaps unimportant is it for MST to connect its work to other, you know, Marxist or leftist causes, structural issues? Because as he says, it's a closed movement, or if it's a closed movement, is its success enabled by its being focused on the single issue? But at the same time, because it's such a structural thing, Antonio, you brought up the question of, you know, income inequality and distribution. It seems like there is also, you know, this also needs to be addressed from the economic, political economic dimension. And then again, in one of the readings, it said that part of the popular support was that they were kind of using this as a justification to, I don't know if this is an old issue, but like to reduce migration or something. And I think this was, and this was kind of like surprising to me. And so again, how connected does a social issue need to be to other, you know, political economic dimensions, or will it kind of not be good strategically? I think, and then another question, and I think it's also building on the relation between the universal and particular, is what happens to the subject of injustice following the resolution of their specific like situation of injustice. If it's the situation of injustice that constitutes their co-re-existence, right? You know, if an impoverished person suddenly, you know, gains like high income, is there still a possibility for this co-re-existence? Maybe talking about the subject of justice. So is that hinting at it? Because then my worry there is, you know, in Freire, he talks about how the oppressed becomes the oppressor and, you know, kind of replicates the very violation of injustice. And so I just want to think about that too.
Thanks, Stefano. You want to pass the mic to Allison?
So this is more of like a comment and reflections. I was born in Ecuador. I grew up in a plantain plantation until the ages of 8, 9. So this is very similar to me. Something that I found fascinating was how like the landless workers movement is basically turning the colonization concept on its head, right? Because like the idea was like these indigenous people don't know what they're doing with their land. They have no concept of property. So that's why it's okay for us to take this land because they're not using it right. They're not putting it to its maximum potential use. Therefore, for the best of society, it's okay for us to use it. So I thought that was fascinating. And I actually think that's one of the reasons why it is so threatening to the coercive power of the state. Because at this point, you're basically saying like, your whiteness, your proximity to whiteness, your proximity to actually being at the top of this society no longer matters. So your property interest can be taken away by somebody else. And as someone who has experienced both first world poverty and third world poverty is a completely different monster. We do not have welfare. There isn't any really things like people will die of hunger, people will starve. When my mom couldn't work anymore as an agronomic engineer in Ecuador, we survived off the land for a couple of months. And we started a battering system with like the people of the deli so we can get like cheese and butter. And with our neighbors as well, we would like trade the plantains. And then I even just now thinking about it, I feel so privileged that we had access to that land because property there and property here is completely different because this is fertile land. This is land that can literally feed you and your family for a really long time. And then again, that changes everything. We're not just, because here, if I'm talking about property, I might have a house, but I still need to get a job. I still need to get access to food, but this land is everything. This land gives you the ingredients to build your shack, to then build your food, and to then give a battering system. So I feel like property even there becomes even more important. And something that was in the New York Times article was how they were still poor, but they were happy. So this idea of like self-sustenance, this idea of working with the land and for the land, it's not even about like wanting a privileged place in society, but just the happiness of being able to provide for oneself. And something that I thought was really funny is a couple of years ago, my mom told me, she's like, I remember when we lived in Ecuador and we would like lay down and just stare at the stars. And I know we were really poor, but I was so happy. So that really did touch me.
Thank you, Allison. Rayan?
So I'm gonna have to start by apologizing. This is gonna be a little bit more technical and less personal than some of the excellent comments that have come before. But I did want to congratulate you, Dr. Asi, on what I thought was an excellent essay that we got to read from you, the concrete experiences of the subject. And I'm very impressed by how you were able to draw upon so very many sources. And I just wanted to sort of ask you about one of those sources, specifically about Levinas, whom we haven't really had the chance to discuss today. And the reason I sort of wanted to zero in on that is, it seems to me that his work is at a perfect parallel to a lot of what we've heard. Professor Harcourt, who pointed us to how in the Denise and Gilbert reading, as well as in Mr. Pele's comments, the role of family values is such an important intersection with this movement and with all of these movements, and how they go about conceptualizing their modes of cooperating with each other. It seems to me to be no coincidence that sort of at the end of totality and infinity, when Levinas is moving past the face-to-face encounter, he goes immediately not to society generally, but to the family as the locus of the epistemic generation of a morality that can really influence let's say a larger scale ethics. Now, the drawback there, of course, is that his language that is incredibly gendered. The family is conceptualized as a place where it's really the father who's
calling upon the son, electing the son to a moral responsibility. And that sort of explodes in the face of what we're seeing with the mothers movement, right? And I was thinking, is your theory in some way, because you've been able to change the departure point in which you focused on earlier when you were talking, because we're now not looking at a subject who's facing the eruption of someone who's asking not to be harmed, but we're starting from a subject that is inflicted by the harm that has been caused to them. Is that why we're seeing a much broader theory that is able to conceptualize these movements?
Thank you, Rayan. Okay, so well, we have three questions that push us in marvelous directions. And let's see how we can weave them together. Do you want to start, Tanya?
Just to start, I think I didn't answer Preston, that you did the first question. I'm sorry, I didn't answer. I don't know if I got it right, but I got the impression that you somehow are asking us, one of the interpretation I would say that you asking us if it's this whole discussion between agency and superstructure, right? I mean, it's always about a superstructure that we are in. And besides that, agency, who you react individually or collectively. So I always see myself struggling between these two structures of thinking now, political philosophy. Are you going to start from the superstructure that you are into? And then Marxism help us a lot to understand that. Or we are going to start from the agency, how you or your partners collectively react to something. And I think you have to combine both. When you see the social movements, they are interfering in both levels. They are creating new subjectivities. If you talk to one of the children of MST that grow up in an assentamento, they have a whole narrative of her history, her family history. So they have a narrative about themselves, and she's changed individually. She's completely changed collectively, because that's why I learned most. I think their sense of collectiveness challenge our sense of collectiveness deeply. It challenges our sense of ontology, like being yourself individually and then cope with someone else. No, it's not about that division. For them, it is an artificial division. You are because the other are. And they take it, that's not something theoretically, they live on that basis. But your question is really good, because we feel a sense of impotence beyond the system. I mean, we are in front of the system. But why I brought the mothers? Why I started with the mothers? Because this is the place of most vulnerability that I've ever been in contact with in my life. Losing a child by a shot in the back. And they are so courageous, not because they are winning. And then for me, Preston, it kind of leads me to, okay, Betania, what about your courage? Okay, you are not fighting the system, but you have a place to fight. You have a position, you are individual, you have your collectivity, you have a place in which you can manifest your ways of fighting. So in that sense, it's good to keep in mind that we have structural power that we are captured into, but we are also collectivities that are able to respond differently. And that I think is really important, especially when you get the vulnerable ones, they are doing that in order to survive. Once I was in one favela in Maré, and one wonderful mother told me, Betania, I told her, we were doing interviews, and do you want to start from someplace? I asked her, just not to impose my agenda, no? I said, yes, I want to raise a point, she told me. Do you know what, Betania? When you come here, you decide that you want to risk your life for this part of 2 hours or 3 hours, because you know the territory of favela is quite dangerous. So you can choose to risk your life. In my case, to be in risk It's a ontological, she didn't say an ontological, it's a condition. I cannot choose not to risk my life. I fight to exist. So, and then I thought, this is unethical. She's putting in front of me absolutely ethical question. She said, how do you compromise with my pain? Not from she knew I was a professor. We are doing that research. She knew my position. So she's asking me, what are you doing from your position? And that leads me to Levina. Because if you bring Levina with the family remark you did, Bernard, the idea of a family is extended. It's absolutely fascinating. Who is the family? Of course, the young in the oldest generation, they are the family. But a close friend is a family. Someone that works in the system, in the juridical system, who wants to really get integrated and cooperate is part of the family. So family for them, it's completely different. What is family for us? Family, they have built the conception what is to belong in a very effective way. Feelings, emotionally. You have to connect emotionally. If you connect emotionally, you become kind of family. They care about you. It's so fascinating to see. And then Levina, for me, answers the question that it's not a theoretical struggle between Occident and decoloniality. You know? I think Levina has a wonderful key concept that brings us to the core of the face of this other. How do I relate with the face of someone that I don't particularly like, I don't particularly understand, and I don't particularly have representation towards it? So, and that's I think it's a fascinating question. Just one, I will lead to Antonio to answer the other questions. Just one remark that I think is I think it's important to make. I think it was Ellison. I think it was you who made this point. Is that the way we consider private property is because we are doing theory, but we're not able to see what they are transforming out there. No? So there is at least in Brazil, we have a problem in academic in the university of not being able, because we shouldn't be translators of the transformations that were taking place and bring this vocabulary to a more sophisticated and elaborated way, no? But what some of those movements are doing with what means to have a property. One of the occupations that I'm working with, Kelly was a wonderful woman. She was on the street when she was 10, and she occupied a house. She occupied a house and she said, that's not going to be a private home. That's going to be a cultural and educational place. So when I went there, I was expecting to find a home just we have in our mind. What is a private home? My bed, my living room. No, she put into a huge barn and say, this is a cultural educational occupation. So it makes me think completely, what is this sense of my private property, collective property, collectiveness going far beyond. And that leads us to ancestrality, because Kelly, when she talks about territory and Quilombo, when they talk about territory is not mine territory. It's the memory that we construct together about territoriality. I'm not saying that I'm going to change my way of living. Of course, I'm not going to be hypocrite. No, but let's learn it from it and say, how could you change our way of seeing things? No, it's kind of an invitation. I will stop here.
No, that's great. That's great. And it also reminds us, before Antonio talks, I mean, it reminds us of the risk of doing this work, right? I mean, it's not, it's, you know, it's yeah, you're assuming a lot of risk, right? With the courage the courage, amazing courage. I mean, just as you read about the movement, right, the amazing courage of these people who are literally occupying land, knowing that there's a high likelihood that the owner is going to come after them violently, right? Go ahead.
Oh, it's good that you mentioned courage because we can connect that to exactly the end of the previous seminar. What 2 years ago? What kind of courage in critical praxis should we have? Not only I, but the courage should we have? And there was another question I didn't put in my post, is precisely the role of critical theory with contemporary critical theory regarding those situations. It's not only the problem of cooptation, it's also about the tools that we will deploy to grasp and to accelerate this circulation of political resistance. So usually critical theory today is, what it's doing is having a partnership with decolonial, post-colonial approaches. At least that's what I'm doing. It's a good way. But why not, doing a bit what, I mean, I don't know if it's subconscious, Bernard, but you didn't make a lot of theory in your book. So, and I think it's something interesting here. There is a kind of Kantian critique of critical theory. Really, what I'm saying that is that maybe we just have to wait. There's something that we don't need to theorize too much now about those processes. And cooperation is good, co-power is good, but we don't need to theorize too much now. And that's why I'm thinking about this kind of calm critique, really in the classic way, just making a pause. That's why I'm connecting with your question, Stefano. Yes, they do cooperate with other movements. They do accelerate other issues such as agroecology, which are lead by women in the movement. They do cooperate with other movements, peasant movements, or the housing movement. They do that. They do sell their vegetables and fruits and other products and alcohol in our university, in PUC Rio University, a private university, a university that fight dictatorship. So I wonder if it's really illegal, this movement. So they do extend and cooperate with other movements. But what they reveal also is that those movements, they are like the mothers, they are precisely, just to see the limits of contemporary critical theory. They are not the political subject. They are the people who do not assemble. And when I'm referring to Negri or Butler, assembly is always framed within Zucconi Park, Indignados. It's those population, middle class, etc. Those ones are the subject that do not assemble. That's why they trace a radical democracy, because they are not here, but they are here. They do assemble, but more than assemble, they do wage legal offensive actions. That's why they're tracing a radical democracy. And just to end, I just remember some lyrics of Samba. Mas digo sinceramente, na vida a coisa mais feia é gente que vive chorando de barriga cheia. Ou seja, meaning, I tell you so it's a very famous samba in Brazil. So it just parts of the words say, so I tell you faithfully that the worst thing in life is the people complaining, I would say, with a full stomach.
Okay, so we've got we're going to take three more comments. Okay, so I've got Leonard Post, Ryan, and Nikita, and Vered. Yes, Vered Engelhardt's going to make a small one. Let me pass the mic. Leonard.
Hi, thank you. It was wonderful presentation. What are the structures of decision-making in both those movements?
Ryan?
Thank you both. Greg Grandin writes that to the Nixon administration, Salvador Allende's administration was far more threatening than Castro's because it showed that democracy wasn't indelibly tied to capitalism. In their case, it was to socialism, and perhaps quite successfully, which is an ideological project, just maintaining that capitalism is tied to democracy. And so to your point, I guess my question is, how threatening is MST to the hegemonic political economy of Brazil? And then, and to your point, Antonio, about the effectiveness, but also inoffensiveness of potentially mutual aid. I wonder what offensive forms of community might happen here. You know, you just mentioned how offensive was Occupy Wall Street or Black Lives Matter in 2020. How and what micro forms of offense, I think to Bernard's point, might be present here and in Brazil in the face of such repressive apparatuses that don't let us critique the Supreme Court at Columbia University.
Hi, so thank you so much. So I'm from India, so there's a lot of parallels. Of course, we've got a lot of people going to study movements in Brazil, specifically, but like there are a couple of things that are swirling in my head. The first is there's so many parallels. Like we recently in India had like an entire farmers movement where they took over land, and this was against these newly drafted farm codes and farm laws, which kind of were corporatizing farming and kind of eliminating the mandi, which is basically the system where everybody, where the farmers directly go to sell their crops. So that was one really large movement. Then the other parallel that was going on in my head is the association of parents of disappeared persons in Kashmir, in Indian occupied Kashmir, which was started by a grieving mother who, Parveena Hangar, who for years has been waiting for her son to come back. And in Kashmir, there are thousands of unmarked graves. So, like in several ways, like we've got the same, like Brazil and India, very similar in terms of distribution of wealth, in terms of corporate forces taking on land, in terms of laws around adverse possession, and also political strategies have been very similar. We've got like something like the Narmada Bachao Andolan, which is an anti-dam movement, which was very similar to what was happening in Brazil and has been continuing for the last 37 years now. I think, but so in all of these processes, there have been, of course, things have moved, but one of the things that we have really struggled and with has been how to mobilize legal support, like, and how to in some way, because supposedly, for example, in Narmada Bachao Andolan, this is lots of dams and 33,000 families being displaced along this whole river to build dams, which they earlier said was for agriculture, but now it is for all the multinational companies, of course. And when you enter litigation, especially when you on to protect those rights, then it becomes like you get sucked into the vortex of litigation, which is one litigation after another litigation after another litigation. So like the Narmada Bachao Andolan office is literally stocked up with files everywhere. And I mean, everybody is just struggling with just how to organize legal resources in this context. And then the movement becomes too much about the law. The other thing that like we've been struggling with is the inability to handle and grapple with identity politics and how to work with gender, class, race, caste, and how do you ensure that the movement is in some way not just like, it's not just about taking the movement one day after another, but it's also about working with these things, because it is a constant politicization that needs to happen. Otherwise, the movement becomes hollow from the inside, and it just becomes like, in India, there's a lot of articulation around the fact that no, we will not do gender because gender will take over the larger struggle. We will not do caste because caste will take over the larger struggle. But then those things eat everything inside. So how do you grapple with those things, or if there are any lessons that you can learn?
Great. Can you pass the mic back to Vered Engelhardt, who has
Thank
been
you.
with the 1313 since I think the first Foucault 1313, but also who's doing work down in Peru on water sowing and similar kind of projects. Go ahead, Vered.
Thank you, Bernard. Yeah, for a while. Too long, maybe. First of all, thank you, obrigado, valeu. Seriously, it's been real to be here and to come back to this space and deal with the subject of land and commons and community and all this. This discussion is very valuable. I've been thinking with y'all, and I think like about the impact of I have like a comment that is also in relation to other questions that were asked in this round. So there's a big controversy at the MASP, the Museum of Art in Sao Paulo, a big museum in Sao Paulo, over a series of photographs by an activist photographer of the MST, of the Landless Movement. These photos, I don't know if you guys know about this, but these photos were censored out of a show that was about the history of Brazil in general. And this censorship fired a whole controversy that led to I think it was the quitting of the two of the curators that were there. One of them, the first indigenous curator in the history of the museum. And it wasn't just them quitting, they articulated their conditions under which they could be rehired. And these conditions were literally making the museum into a commons. I mean, they truly deconstructed the modern museum. And so it was this censorship that led to a letter that it's the curators, I wrote that up, don't forget, Sandra Benitez and Clarissa Diniz. I highly recommend, I don't know if anyone has translated this letter, but I highly recommend you guys reading it, because they really—
Maybe you'll translate it for us, so we'll put it on the website.
Yeah, perhaps I could do it. If there's no translation, I could do it myself. I think it's really worth it. But I just kind of wanted to say this because of the sort of ripple effect that MST exposure, and they're so good at media, you know, they're so good at the way they handle media, which is very important in Brazilian struggles. And yeah, so I kind of wanted to mention that because this sort of deconstruction of the museum, I think, by the hands of also an indigenous curator, I think it's also related to a larger movement you're talking about as well, and people in Brazil resonate like with the aquilombamento urbano, the sort of making of the quilombo in the quilombo logic and tradition in urban spaces, and this relates a lot as well, not as someone who people who are in quilombola or who are in favelados can also participate
in the sort of like extended family networks, no? In the making family, you were talking about, Betania, this strategy or what I took as like making family as political strategy as well. And I think this, the question of Preston about censorship, I think about, I feel this all the time at Columbia and other spaces. And I remember once I was talking to a Brazilian scholar who was visiting here. And I spoke very frankly to her about certain opinions, political opinions and disagreements I had with people here. And then at one point I stopped myself and I was like, oh no, I'm making bad politics. And she's a feminist anti-racist scholar. She was like, no, you're doing another politics. And I learned so much from her saying that. And I think the sort of speaking up and making bonds has a lot to do with that, no? Because as we sort of like go up in these hierarchies, like they try to individualize us, to make us more into singular units, you know? And I think this making family inside these spaces, too, seeing each other, recognizing each other, is also a way of pushing that sort of aquilombamento strategy without obviously appropriating the quilombo tradition, you know? So that was one thing, and I think this relates to also something I wanted to say about the sort of queerness of MST spaces that I encountered in Rio. That MST related spaces were very, very queer friendly. The stores where they sell the produce, they employ travestis, and you know, it's not something that can be said for a lot of places in Rio. So I think this is also related to this sort of expanded notion of family as political strategy as well, and this non-theorizable, the non-theorizable, I think is huge. No, you're naming the samba, you're showing the funk. There's just layers of this highly effective politics that are just like non-theorizable, and that's okay too.
Thank you so much, Vera. That was a marvelous contribution. So what we're going to do now is actually we're going to have final comments. You can address as much as you can, but there's a lot on the table, but also some final thoughts, because we're going to need to bring the seminar to wrap it up. Betania, you want to start?
No, first to say thank you very much. No, it's really meaningful to be here and having this kind of conversation and discussion, and I think it changes a lot the kind of imaginary that we can be able to construct in the future. So to see that you guys are involved in that kind of discussion, and for me is really hopeful that a good utopian, that okay, university has a chance to survive. So it's really brilliant to be here. I think one thing that I want to point it out, and then I struggled with myself in the last 2 years and deconstructing myself and Derridianally speaking, is that one thing that I heard from them quite often was they feel the university to be a very violent environment. And I was so shocking. How come? Well, we are friendly, we want to listen. And that when I started to understand that besides all the marks, what I call the spatiality of the subject, race, gender, social class, disability, and so on. So all the marks that we have in our bodies, it's violent, of course. Me, as in Brazil, a white intellectual woman from middle high class. So I carry in my body, the violence that so it was really important to transform me. And that goes to one of the points that you made, that okay, their production of knowledge, it's so powerful that could be difficult to theorize, but they are producing knowledge a lot. a lot. And the university are being unable to transform that knowledge in something that can help us to build knowledge, because we are those officially in charge of producing knowledge. And what for me was so transforming is that, okay, I have to be a bridge. I have to fulfill this place, but fulfilling this place also means that I have to feel uncomfortable many times. And that's part of the process of it. So that's one thing. And another thing that I want to say, and then I finish, that I learned from political philosophy all the time that you have to choose between an agonistic way of political thinking and a consensus way of political thinking. So I'm from a generation that was kind of built into that structure. And I kind of cope it all the time. When you see them social movements doing consensus and dissensus at once, because they are full of contradictions. Contradictions are part of human nature of being socializing. And once I see the first fight between two mothers, said, okay, that's the end. Not the end. That's just one step. It's conflict is, so we have no, we have not elaborated theoretically this idea that conflict and dissensus comes together. And we don't need to choose between two. It's part of it. And I think that's it, isn't it? I stop.
Excellent. Thank you, Betania. Antonio.
The question regarding the decision making and the participation. So the MST in two things is organized at 3 points, 3 kind of activities. There is the legal associations that will create the cooperation, the cooperatives. There are the associations. After, there is the task force. For instance, the task force on human rights, on education, on finances, and on the top, the decision-making, the political representation. And there you have different organisms. You have the National Congress, the State Congress, the national meetings, and they end until the level 1, the local one, the nucleus, the nuclei. So here's the decision-making. It's usually through consensus, so but also struggles, but usually they try to have a cooperation democracy. So it's the 3 kind of organization. It's perfectly explained in the Hammond paper and the Sylvia paper that are online, and I also make a kind of summary in the post about that. So these are the organization. Regarding the offensive strategy, I think it was Alan. So just to think about the offensive doesn't mean violence. To the contrary, no, we're not talking about violence. But regarding the experience of the MST, 2 other things: partnership with the lawmakers and lawyers. For instance, the MST succeed in having leading offensive litigation, offensive legality, with a strong partnership with the network of popular lawyers in Brazil. We have at PUC Rio popular network at the university, and students participate and they attend the communities, in favelas or elsewhere. The MST work with them. And the other thing I didn't mention in my paper, but it's really the MST is kind of aggressive in having financial resources. They have a partnership with a new bank called the Left Bank, with socialist and solidarity values, but it's not socialist washing. It's so that the access to resources, even in the high finances. Final thought, I was thinking about, sometimes we can say that the problem with Brazil is that everything we say about it is true. No, it's true. But it's not a problem. I mean, it's a colleague of mine in France say that, but it's not a problem. Maybe we can say it's to the contrary an opportunity. Brazil is a country where different worlds coexist, and the 2 worlds coexist. For instance, at the level of the agrarian with other, in the agriculture, you have two ministers, two secretary of agriculture, one for the massive export-oriented agriculture, and another minister for family-oriented agriculture. Those two worlds coexist in Brazil. But this example of agriculture, it exists under Lula, but it exists under Bolsonaro also, and so it's not something new. It just represents the talk or our presentation today, the radicality of experiences in Brazil. The bad things, yes, of course, but also the tremendous creativity and resistance and courage and resilience of millions of people that we don't talk, that are invisible, that for the fact of being alive demonstrates an act of political resistance, just to be alive. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. All right, well, thank you so much, Betania and Antonio, for an extraordinary session. So please join us next week. So we've got we've got more coming next week on Monday and Tuesday. On Monday evening, October 23, at 6:30 p.m. at the Maison Française, we're going to have a screening, and Etienne Balibar will be there, and it's going to be a screening of this documentary called Leap, Imagination in Power. It's about a strike in France at the Leap factory. That was a watchmaking factory. They were going out of business. It was 1968. They were going out of business, and then the workers, this long strike, and then they actually took it over and became kind of worker owners. So it became this extraordinary experiment in cooperative there. We're going to have that followed by a kind of discussion with Etienne Balibar. Etienne Balibar chose this documentary as the perfect contribution to cooperation. So that's going to be great. And then on Tuesday night, we'll be in conversation with Etienne Balibar at 6:15 at the Maison Française. We'll be talking about expropriators and the expropriated. So that's going to be our next session, Coöperism 513. All right, so join us for that both Monday and Tuesday, and it's going to be kind of a combo conversation. I want to give a big thanks to Reno, who's becoming our producer here, and to Kiana Takavi, who's becoming our executive producer here. Thank you so much. And now we transform from Coöperism 1313 to a album launch and Antonio transforms from Antonio Pele to Sol Flaneur. And we're going to go across the street. We're going to have a party for the music launch of Sol Flaneur, the new album. And so here we go. We can't wait to listen to all the music. All right, join us. Thanks.
Arizona velvet flavor, repress, hitting holes in the mirror, lavender, shaking like a blue top post, the secret sound, dying love, a candy flows. I was 17 and I was ready for all the dreams I was dying for. Over the sail, I was hiding pain and thoughts, fear and shapes were just like clouds above, and me and the rain were looking for an asylum between the shades. There was something brewing, spoken. I was 17 and I was ready for living all the dreams I was dying for.
Dans la chambre lavande dans l'armoire. Dans la chambre, il y a des pensées au plafond, des secrets papillons, des regrets tourbillons. Dans la chambre, il y a
I was 17 and I was ready for living all the dreams I was dying for. Wooden base, Arizona velvet flavor, fever repress, hitting holes in the mirror, lavender, shaking like a blue top bows, a secret sound, dying love, a candy flows. I was 17 and I was ready for leaving all the dreams I was dying for.